Now that we've gotten through the entire procurement process, let's look back on public procurement and discuss how a contract officer has to conduct themselves in order to protect their employer from lawsuits, a bad reputation, or hurting citizens or vendors. We will also talk about auditing and accountability in public procurement. It may seem odd to put these together, but they all go hand in hand. If something is ethical, you shouldn't be worried about audits. If you're holding yourself accountable to the standards of your organization, your team, and the contract you're in charge of, then you don't have to worry about ethical violations. The way I've structured this lecture is to give you an overview of each concept, then how it applies to local governments, and then how it applies to public procurement specifically. Finally, I'm going to introduce you to special procurement programs and why they're great and also challenging at the same time. So what are ethics? Everyone says you should be ethical and conduct yourself ethically and promote ethics in everyday operations, but for the purposes of discussion today, ethics is a system of standards that dictate behavior. They're often specific to the organization or the field of work. When I taught this class in person, I used to have my big boss, Kay Elmore, come speak to the group. She's the director of procurement for the city and does this great talk on ethics. She begins by asking who sped in their car today, or who has ever taken a pen from their office. These are very small examples, but you can see where she's going. Ethics often has to do with how you feel, and not necessarily what you're doing. I take that a step further in this lecture by saying ethics in organizations is often not just about how you feel, but often about what's legal and what's best practices across the organization. So, like I said, ethics in local government are dictated by state and federal laws, best practices gleaned from other organizations, and then also what is best for the community. State and federal laws tell us the structure of how to conduct our business by explaining what is and is not legal. Best practices help by showing what our peers in local governments or other departments across the county or country are doing, which is often how those local governments are interpreting their laws. Finally, you have to consider what's best for residents. At the end of the day, local government employees are public servants and, as such, are responsible for providing the best services at the best value to the community. So, more specifically, ethics in public procurement means operating within the law while using best practices. But remember earlier in the semester how when we discussed how service contracting isn't really written down in a lot of state laws? That means that we have to do a lot of interpreting of what the state would like us to do should there be a law. A big part of what governs the contract of procurement professionals is fostering or maintaining the relationship between the vendors and the local government. If we don't treat vendors with respect and make sure we present their needs during the proposal and negotiation phase, we're not behaving ethically. On the flip side, if we don't represent the government's interests and those of the community while dealing with vendors, we're also not being ethical. Often, we're just trying to keep ourselves out of the paper. Since public procurement officers interface with the public, vendors, and the community extensively, there are a lot of opportunities to represent the local government, and your job is to do this positively and with respect for all the parties involved. So remember that Kate Elmore used to speak to our class, that I mentioned that earlier? These are 3 questions that she discusses every time I hear her speak about ethics and procurement. The first one is it legal? In other words, will you be violating any criminal laws, civil laws, or city policies by engaging in a particular behavior or activity? This is usually pretty easy to figure out. Either it's legal, it's not, or the laws don't discuss it at all. In which case, you kind of have to move to the second question. Does it promote a win-win situation? This means that the result is fair to all parties concerned, both in the short term and as well as in the long term. Moreover, will the decision benefit those involved directly as well as indirectly? If you're still unable to come to a clear answer, you ask yourself the third question. How does this make me feel? Most of us know the difference between right and wrong, but when push comes to shove, how does this decision make you feel about yourself? Are you proud of yourself for making this decision, or would you like others to know about the decision that you made? Most of the time, when dealing with grade decisions, such as those in service contracting, just one of these questions is not enough because it's just not written down in state policy, and you're not really sure if it's going to promote a win-win. But by taking a time to reflect on all 3 questions, you will oftentimes find that the answer becomes very clear. So how do you and your staff avoid ethics violations? I've listed some common policies that local governments often have for their procurement professionals, which are pretty self-explanatory. But at the end of the day, it's really about doing the right thing within the laws of your state or the federal government, depending on what's governing the activities you're doing. When you get into a gray area, when the right thing is hard to determine, go back to those 3 questions that I mentioned earlier that Kay gave. So I grabbed a couple headlines from across the U.S. just to illustrate that local government procurement makes it into the news all the time. There's so much that can go wrong while you are procuring goods, services, or technology because you have access to extensive funding and can affect the decision of the evaluation team to one vendor or another, which you shouldn't, by the way. What I've learned over several years of working in public procurement is that the press loves phrases like no big contracts and sole sourcing, and often they won't ask questions about why the local government decided to only award to one vendor or allowed a project to be a sole sourced contract. The moral of the story is don't expect the press to do you any favors, so make sure you conduct yourself in an ethical manner at all times. So, auditing. Auditing is the act of one organization assessing the actions, records, and outputs of another organization. The word audit may strike fear into a public administrator, but they are a routine and necessary part of yearly activities. Sorry, my foster cat just tried to jump on the desk. I'm going to try to put her out of the room. I hope you guys all appreciate all the humor of my cats trying to get into our video here, but I promise we're going to get through the rest of it without any trouble. So I want to tell you a little bit about general auditing and then discuss how audits may affect public contracting. So every jurisdiction is required to have an annual audit performed by an external auditing company each year. This ensures the municipality is operating on a balanced budget, didn't make any incorrect payments, and handles its money within state statutes. Local governments will also often get audited directly by the state if they receive significant state funds for specific programs or services. Neither of these is anything to be concerned about, they're just business as normal. In addition, municipalities will have their own internal auditor or auditing department for internal records, often called internal audit. Internal audit is responsible for reviewing records across the jurisdiction. This is a really diverse need because at any given time, they could be reviewing a potential vendor's financial statements, a specific contract to make sure we are paying the vendor what a vendor said they would charge us, or an entire program like procurement cards. A lot of what internal audit reviews relates to purchasing and contracts, so procurement officers must maintain a good working relationship with internal audit and alert them whenever they think something may be going wrong. Sorry. No. There we go. There are special situations that may require audits throughout the year. If a particular media outlet decides they don't like how the jurisdiction is handling something, then internal audit or a third-party auditor has to step in and review that. For example, if the Charlotte Observer thought Mecklenburg County was paying female sheriff's officers less than male sheriff's officers, internal audit might review past years' paychecks and salaries data to provide data on the issue to the paper. So contract audits may take many forms. The municipality's internal audit department may decide to audit a contractor or a group of contracts administered by the procurement department. Again, this is rarely personal, it's just something that happens and you just go with it. The procurement office itself or internal audit may decide they want to audit a particular vendor's records to ensure that they're paying their employees what they agreed to, paying their taxes as required, or to determine whether the hours, tasks, or deliverables they promised to deliver were done appropriately. Again, this is very routine, it doesn't necessarily mean anything is wrong. And as I mentioned before, it could be that the press or another outside agency raises questions about a contractor or group of contracts so that may spur the municipality to hire an outside auditor or to provide unbiased results. So, can you prevent audits? The answer is yes and no. Sometimes auditing is out of your control because either it's required by the grant you're funding a contract with, it's required by the state or local government you work for, or the media just gets a bee in their bonnet and they feel like picking on your contract. However, to prevent an audit, you can do a couple things. First and foremost, and I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here because we've talked about this a lot through the semester, but you must keep detailed records of the vendor's performance. This requires monitoring what they do and reporting when they're not doing well. As you monitor and keep your records, it's important to always go back to the contract and make sure that both the local government and the vendor are upholding the requirements of the contract. If you can do all that, you're much less likely to get audited. But again, you're probably going to get audited at some point. As I mentioned, some audits are inevitable, so if you are alerted that your contract or contracts will be audited, make sure to gather all your relevant records immediately. This includes all emails sent back and forth regarding the contract, meeting notes, or other documents created as part of the contract activities. Remember I showed you some example spreadsheets last week on how you can keep track of what the vendor is doing, both routine and for liquidated damages? Those are really helpful when you get audited. Sometimes it may be appropriate to alert the vendor, and sometimes it is not about an audit. If the audit is routine or expected, definitely alert the vendor because it's really only fair to do so. If there is suspected malfeasance on the part of the vendor, you may not want to alert them, thus giving them time to destroy records or create false records. But at the end of the day, if you've done your job, audits should not be scary. Often they can be turned into an opportunity if you have done everything right and the vendor is doing their job. Audits are a good time to show the world how well the local government can work with the vendor together to serve citizens. So I want to talk really briefly about accountability. I think of ethics as when you should act appropriately in case anyone is looking. But accountability is when you act appropriately regardless if anyone is looking or not. Even if you don't think you will ever get audited, no one but you will review the vendor's performance, or the project is low dollar or low risk, it's still important to conduct yourself in an accountable way. Even if no one is watching, local governments still have a responsibility to many stakeholders. Citizens, other governments, political parties, local businesses, and the employees of the local government all rely on the municipality to do the right thing, regardless of whether that action is written in law or policy. These parties need the government's services, protection, and outputs like clean water and safe streets, which means the government is accountable to all of those parties. And because we're beholden to all these stakeholders, it's important for procurement officers to not just dot all the I's and cross all their T's. It's also their job to foster relationships between vendors and the government, between departments when there's a multi-department solicitation going on, and among evaluation team members. I mention this under accountability because it's not technically part of the job description, but it is what separates a good procurement officer from a great procurement officer. Accountability also has a lot to do with how we solicit, carry out, and monitor contracts. It's so easy to just put a contract out there and sit back and let the services happen. In reality, that's what most contract administrators do because they don't want to spend time to keep an eye on the vendor every day. The reality is that contract management takes time, and it's the time spent on the part of the procurement officer and the contract administrator to make sure vendors comply with their contract requirements and provide the highest level of service possible. I'm going to end this lecture here because the rest of what we're going to do is going to take more than the 2 minutes and 15 seconds I have left, so make sure you tune in to part 2 of the lecture.